The Wild West conjures up images of lonesome cowboys and barroom brawls, but what about the children? The answers may surprise you. This is what it was really like being a kid in the American frontier. For children in many cultures in the Wild West, picking up and moving to a new home was a regular fact of life. That was certainly the case for many generations of American Indian children whose tribes moved back and forth across the Great Plains. Native tribes moved to trade, hunt game, harvest, and to maintain relationships with other groups across the seasons. Children in tribes such as the Cheyenne, Osage, and Sioux were expected to take part in the task of moving camp. And children in pioneer families moving from east to west had to complete their daily chores despite the long miles of walking and harsh conditions faced on the trail.
There's no looking back. We've come too far.
While some kids accepted the constant moving or even looked forward to the adventure, others found it terrifying. They knew that the environment could very well kill them, and they likely struggled to understand why their families were leaving behind everything they'd ever known. From the sweeping expanses of the nearly featureless plains to the lightning that lit up the sky above their unprotected heads, the trail held terror for some children. Frontier life was stressful, and less practical social conventions often fell to the wayside. Unmarried men living in rural outposts might take on traditional feminine tasks like cooking and doing their own laundry. Likewise, women could find themselves tasked with the sort of heavy labor that in other circumstances would be reserved for men only. But as time went on and the Wild West became less wild, many communities saw the division of labor according to gender return. Sometimes people of the Old West presented themselves as someone of another gender for protection or to take advantage of a society that had more on its mind than enforcing a strict gender binary. These shifting gender roles also applied, at least sometimes, to children. The important thing on the frontier was to get the work done. If that meant a boy did girls' work, such as childcare, or a girl took on traditional masculine tasks, then so be it. While pioneer families were claiming land and establishing homesteads throughout the Old West, the truth is that people had lived on that land for millennia. Before the arrival of white settlers and the accompanying restrictions that led to the Indian Wars and the reservation system, many tribes of the Great Plains, including the Sioux, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Kiowa, and more, lived in largely nomadic lifestyle. Pueblo tribes such as the Zuni and Hopi were typically more settled by the time of the pioneers. Culturally, children were often valued and guided by members of their community beyond their immediate family. Amongst the plain tribes, very young children stayed close to their mothers for the first few years of their lives. Babies could be wrapped up in a cradle board that was carried on a mother's back. As they grew, boys might expect to be given new names, but that was a less frequent occurrence for girls. Amongst the Blackfeet, some young people would be designated as the tribe's favored child, a pampered scion of a prominent family who might expect to take on the mantle of leadership one day. Across many tribes, Native American children were expected to work as they grew older and take on increasingly complex adult tasks, as well as learn the ins and outs of their prescribed social roles. However, physical punishment among the indigenous Americans was a rarity. Though life in the Old West could be harsh and often required children to do all sorts of work, it wasn't all suffering and drudgery. Children were still recognized as children who should be given the opportunity to play. Of course, there wasn't a big box store down the street full of plastic toys with bright flashing lights and recorded music. Toys in the Old West could be pretty expensive, especially for a pioneer family with a limited budget. Their children were more likely to take common items from their everyday lives, such as wheelbarrows and sheets, to create their own fun. Imaginative play was widespread, as were social occasions that attempted to make a good time out of food preparation, such as cheese-making parties and an ice cream-like concoction of hot maple syrup and snow. Native children also had plenty of opportunities for play. Some kids took a loop of string and wove an elaborate version of what we might call today a cat's cradle. Other toys helped to develop hand-eye coordination, like a hoop and dart contraption that had kids attempting to pass the dart through a rolling hoop. They were often obliged to get creative, such as when Lakota children used spare animal bones to create bone ponies that some settler children also played with. Though the structure of life and child supervision in the Wild West may have been seriously different from today, one thing was all but certain: school. A community couldn't expect to be taken seriously until it had a schoolhouse, even if it was a humble one-room affair. In fact, one-room schoolhouses were fairly common. Often, it made more sense to ask students to travel a short distance to a small school rather than a longer distance to a larger centralized school building. But it wasn't always easy to establish a school. Teachers, usually just one instructor per school, were expected to manage multiple grades at once. Furthermore, community members were expected to maintain the school, from building desks to keeping the wood-burning stove going to feeding and housing the teacher. And who got to go to school? Not everyone had equal access. Non-white children were sometimes barred from attending school by laws that deemed them inferior and unfit to sit alongside white students. Some communities, such as those of Chinese immigrants living in California, came together and opened their own schools. And still others, especially the poorest families living in the Southwest, got barely any schooling past what local friars could cobble together. When it came to Native American children, the frontier education system had a dark, ugly side. The schools established for tribal children were not charitable enterprises. Instead, the boarding schools that began to spring up throughout the country had a mandate to obliterate traditional tribal culture. American Indian children forced to attend were given English names, made to dress in European-style clothing, and required to practice Christianity. They were continually told their culture was shameful.
It was more accurately should be called ethnic cleansing rather than assimilation.
The early 19th century saw these schools set up on or near reservations, but allowing children to live with their families made assimilation more difficult, so the U.S. government began to fund boarding schools that separated kids from their loved ones. One of the most notorious, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, opened in 1879, inspired similar institutions across the United States and Canada.
And I remember at the church being told that what my parents practiced will send them to hell.
Many children who attended these schools reported trauma ranging from public shaming to physical abuse. Disease ran rampant through overcrowded schools, and quite a few institutions had dedicated cemeteries for children who died in their care. If a child attempted to run away, schools might offer a bounty to anyone who brought them back. Though federal law mandated boarding school attendance for Native kids in 1891, many Native parents fought back. It wasn't until the 1970s that most of these schools finally closed, while a small number continue to operate today. In the Old West, death was simply the final fact of life, and the mortal dangers faced by frontier children and their families weren't always predictable. Some settlers feared attacks from Native Americans, but tribal people could be friendly, and seemingly dangerous wild animals usually tended to keep their distance. And despite the gruesome fate of the stranded and starving Donner Party, most settlers managed to keep everyone fed. The real danger came from illness, which could take the life of a young person who got sick far from a doctor's office. A sip of stagnant water teeming with microbes was far more likely to kill someone living in the Wild West than a rattlesnake or a misfiring gun. Children were especially vulnerable to malnutrition, fevers, and dehydration, all of which could have a devastating effect on their small bodies.
If her wounds don't fester, she might could have a fighting chance.
The proliferation of disease and lack of clean water led to a grim infant mortality rate. It's hard to imagine, but in the 1870s, 1 in 5 children would die before reaching their first birthday. And given that so many people lived in isolated rural areas without ready access to doctors, midwives, and record keepers, the true number may never be known. The Hollywood version of the Wild West tends to be pretty monochromatic. There were whites and there were Native people. But the reality of the frontier West was far more diverse. Black and Latino people were certainly part of the landscape. In fact, the whole concept of cowboys comes from the Latin American vaquero. So too were Asian Americans, who made up about 30% of Idaho's population in 1870. Yet these people and their children were faced with widespread racism. Anti-Chinese sentiment grew in intensity after Chinese workers arrived in the United States to work in mining and railroad industries. An economic downturn resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which greatly limited Chinese people's entry into the country.
It was unlike any law enacted since the founding of the Republic. Singling out as never before a specific race and nationality for exclusion.
Those who were granted admittance had to go through an intense interview process, children included. If they failed to pass official scrutiny, kids could be barred from entry along with their families. Once living in the U.S., Asian American children of the West often found themselves in an awkward space. There was the obvious discrimination, such as when a business openly barred Chinese and other Asian people from even entering the premises. But on a deeper level, many Asian American children were pressured to retain their Asian cultural identity by family, but they also had to assimilate in order to navigate American society. This resulted in confused and isolated kids who felt excluded from both cultures. Given that the Wild West could be a pretty diverse place, it should come as no surprise that people of different backgrounds came together and formed families. But though a town on the American frontier might have a wide array of people both living there and passing through, older, more bigoted ways of thinking often still prevailed. This meant that children of mixed-race relationships faced a complicated and sometimes bumpy road. Part of the issue was the social upheaval experienced by many people in the period after the Civil War. People moved all about the country, sometimes establishing new families when they still had an old one in their previous home. Yet the post-war period, an increasing number of states with anti-miscegenation laws made those unions and the resulting children inconvenient. Some men simply abandoned their non-white families. So-called half-breed children of one native and one white parent were often ostracized by both societies, leaving them in a painful in-between space. Children with prominent parents could escape the worst of it, such as Sacagawea's son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, but few were so lucky. Part of the fundamental nature of childhood is the fact that it must end. However, the concept of a transitional stage such as the teenage years may have seemed strange to the families of the Wild West. In fact, the whole idea of the teenager wouldn't arise until well into the 20th century. Yet quite a few communities in the Old West recognized the moment when children transitioned to adulthood and held rituals and observances to mark the occasion.
What you didn't say is yes, ma'am.
Women don't say that to each other.
Oh, so you're a woman now.
Out of necessity, most kids on the frontier were expected to grow up faster than they are today. For white families, this change was sometimes marked by traditional observances such as a bar mitzvah for the relatively rare Jewish children, although Jewish people very definitely lived and worked in the Wild West. Latino families may have observed something like a quinceañera with its Aztec roots, though the celebrations we see today have their origins in the 1930s. When they reached puberty, many American Indian children found themselves spending more time with adults of their own gender, falling into traditional patterns of gendered work and recreation. Some tribes encouraged them to engage with their impending adulthood by going on spiritual quests, which might involve a journey, fasting, and spiritual rites.